Right, what I'm going to do is talk about the threat from serious and organised crime. I might be reiterating some of what's been said earlier, but hopefully put a slightly different slant on that, because I think we've got a very real challenge in landing serious and organised crime as something that should be of concern to policymakers, communities, agencies. I think it's a very real challenge for us because I don't think it's landed as well as it might. I'm inevitably going to talk about the NCA and what we're about, some of the challenges that we face, some of the challenges that I think we share with agencies represented in this room and elsewhere. And then we'll have some questions. And hopefully what will come through very clearly in what I'm going to talk about is the sort of challenge that we've got to have a real effect. So rather than just talking about it, having a real effect. I was in here for one of the breakout sessions just before this one. There was a talk about situational crime prevention. It may be an old-fashioned view, but I do believe that locking up criminals is probably quite important around tackling serious and organised crime. And I sometimes get a bit concerned when we end up with this debate which appears a bit binary, which is locking up criminals important of itself or other things? It's all important. That's why the whole strategy is around pursuing criminals, prevent, protect, prepare. We have to do all of it. And what we're going to unashamedly focus on is pursuing those people involved in serious and organised crime, bringing them to justice when we can, taking their resources off them, put them into the judicial system and hopefully seeing them go into prison. If not, we're going to disrupt them. And disruption, I think, is something that applies to everyone in this room, whether it's about giving us the knowledge of what works, whether it's about the role of local authorities, law enforcement, the whole of government. I think it's a very real challenge for all of us. So, the really big change that comes with the NCA is for the first time there's a single agency that's got the responsibility to lead the UK's fight to cut serious and organised crime. Some important words in there. Lead is absolutely central to what we're about. So in a distributed policing and law enforcement system where we've got agencies called police forces that have particular geographic responsibilities, and then we have a number of national agencies, some of which are coming into the NCA, some of which Serious Fraud Office as an example will continue to exist. My basic logic, the logic of the Home Secretary, the logic of government is you understand the problem and you need a response that tackles that particular problem. And given that whatever example you want to use heroin, 95% of the heroin on UK streets comes from Afghanistan. It goes from Afghanistan, it gets trafficked, it comes through a point of entry, it then gets distributed like a virus all across the UK. If you want to tackle that, there's no point in intervening in one part. You've got to intervene from source, transit, point of entry, right the way through to neighbourhoods. If you want to do that, you've got to do it in a joined-up way. There isn't so much resource that we've got people hanging around waiting to do things, so you have to make rational choices. And our role is to make sure that we collectively, law enforcement, make rational choices based on intelligence that prioritises our effort right the way from source all the way through to street. Now, our particular role is about lining all of that up, but the capabilities that we bring aren't about neighbourhood policing, they're not about local responses, they're about capabilities that wouldn't otherwise be accessible to law enforcement, or it's not sensible that we have, if you use police as an example, 45 versions of that particular capability. So the central idea is one of leadership. Now, there's been quite a lot of focus, particularly as the Crime and Courts Bill went through Parliament, quite a lot of focus on powers to direct. I'll talk a little bit about those, but I think those actually are on the margins. I think having the power to direct and insist that tasks are undertaken, frankly, its symbolism is more important than its operation. Because the symbolism is we're serious about lining up our response. That's the really important bit. But for the avoidance of doubt, if something needs doing and it's not getting done, then I'll direct that it gets done, because that's the important way that we line up. But I think that'll be in extremis, and one would hope we never need to do that, because I think the system's broken if we need to do that. So, given that I want to focus on pursue, I'm probably going to express some of the problem around criminals and groups. So law enforcement estimates there's 37,000 people in the UK involved in serious and organised crime. That's not precise, it's an estimate, it's intelligence assessment. We think they're operating in about 5,500 groups on a continuing basis, mostly focused on making money as a lifestyle, sometimes focused on other benefits to them, such as sexual gratification as a result of the exploitation of children. However you want to cut it, in my judgment, people who choose to have a lifestyle which profits from other people's misery, frankly puts them in a despicable crowd, and therefore they should expect the most robust law enforcement response possible, and they should expect the whole of government to engage in that and to challenge these people. Now, it is about prevent, it is about protect, it is about prepare. I agree with all of that. The NCA's got a role in supporting all of that. Some threats are frankly going to be better tackled through one of the other P's. But in terms of pursue, we have to remember the sort of people that we're dealing with and the sort of law enforcement response that's required. And it has to be relentless disruption, preferably bringing them to justice, if not, making it very, very difficult, if not impossible, for them to perpetrate their misery on others. I know, Mike, I've heard you speak before, and a couple of colleagues outside just fed back to me. I think the way in which you're tackling it in Durham and the way that you've explained it absolutely makes that point. We have to take these people on and make it very difficult. The trouble is with organised crime group mapping, which is what I've just talked about, the 37,000 individuals, it sort of doesn't reflect the whole nature of the problem. So here's another statistic. CEOP Command, Child Exploitation Online Protection Command, part of the NCA, estimate that there are up to 50,000 people in the UK who access child abuse images online. 50,000. That's an awful lot of people that range from occasional access through to people who make, distribute, sell those images. That's before we talk about economic crime, before we talk about corruption, before we talk about some of the issues around cyber, which I think are very significant. So you get a sense that if you're about pursue, it's a lot of bad people doing some pretty awful things to people who are often quite vulnerable. And the effect of that is felt in neighbourhoods up and down the country across a whole range of threats. But pursue them we must, and that must be prioritised. One of the, I think, very significant steps forward that government have achieved is getting organised crime positioned as a national security threat. Now, there's no sort of agreed definition of what a national security threat is, but those people who really know about this tell me that it's something that happens that's a challenge to our very lifestyle and the legitimacy of the state. Now, it seems to me someone like Dale Cregan running around Greater Manchester, letting off hand grenades and assassinating police officers, appears to me to be a challenge to our way of life and a threat to the legitimacy of the state. And government agree. So organised crime is seen as a national security threat alongside CT and pandemic and other threats. As is cybercrime, as is people trafficking, they're seen as national security threats. Why is that important? It's important because, going back to something I heard in the other session, which I absolutely agree with, whilst I believe that pursue, use a shorthand, you can't arrest your way out of the problem, of itself is not the solution. It's an important part of a solution. Frankly, it's not just about law enforcement, it's about a whole government approach. So seen through a pursue prism, let's think about those 37,000 individuals. I'd like to know what's on their tax returns. I'd like to know how they access websites, which websites they access, how we collect that data. So having a whole government approach about people crossing borders, how all of that works, is absolutely key. So hopefully what you can see is there's an international right the way through to the local issue, and there's a breadth of government, breadth of law enforcement, frankly a breadth of responsibility for citizens for how we tackle organised crime that brings a great deal of complexity for all of us. So some examples of what will be different in an NCA era. Well, the first thing is some of what we're inheriting from agencies that have gone before, I've got to say, is excellent. I'll give you an example. The overseas network that we're inheriting from soccer, I think, is outstanding. 130 or so officers, supported by locally engaged staff, with reach into 150 countries. All of the countries that I've been to talk about what soccer are doing tell me the fantastic effect they have. The effect they've had in Colombia, in Afghanistan and elsewhere is absolutely outstanding. So we're going to build on that. We've got a broader remit, so we'll need to think about which countries we need to be in around cyber. That's quite different to narcotics. People trafficking, that's quite different again. So there's a positioning of our resources in a sensible way upstream, but to be clear, we've inherited some very, very good capabilities. But some new things that we need as well. So cyber, as an example. We still have this, I think, notion in law enforcement and maybe elsewhere that cybercrime is some sort of niche threat, that it's all about network intrusion, it's all about malware development, malware deployment. Of course, it is all about those things, but it's about other things as well. So we tend to think of cybercrime in three ways. Pure cybercrime, the crime that you can only commit because the internet exists, network intrusion, for example. cyber-enabled crime, so old crime using new ways, and the digital footprint that we have to deal with in all of the investigations that we undertake. And I think we have a long way to go in building the sort of capacity and capability we need to tackle all of that. So the idea that people who exploit children, who now do it online rather than outside the school gates, so children are getting targeted in their bedrooms on their computer, people who undertake little and often fraud on the basis they hope it doesn't get reported, and if it does, it sort of flies below the radar, or people who are organising their shipment of Class A drugs on the internet. That is the modern law enforcement environment, just as much as the street, just as much as people's homes. We've got the National Cybercrime Unit, biggest capability we've ever had in the UK. We will continue to invest in our capabilities, because I think there's also some big opportunities around cybercrime. If you accept the notion, the forensic notion, that every contact leaves a trace, that's true in a digital environment as well. It's also true that if you want to know what I'm doing and where I am and who I'm associating with, you probably don't need to follow me around. If you have a sense of who I'm speaking to on my phone, how I use my credit card, what I'm doing online, where my registration number of my car pings up on ANPR. So there are opportunities that come with cyber and a data-led view of investigation and pursuing offenders, as well as some very real risks. But one of the things that we'll bring is an acute focus on pure cybercrime and supporting law enforcement in building its capability. But I think we have some very real challenges around building that capability and actually getting up to a point where we can confidently police and enforce the law on the internet. We have a border policing capability, so we've got trained and experienced investigators now deployed in joint border intelligence units and operating at the border. We haven't taken over the whole of what was UKBA and Border Force, but we've got the ability to task and coordinate them. We're working alongside them. We're making sure that we're all working to a common understanding of what some of the risks are. There's an issue about turning the border into an opportunity rather than a risk, because as an island nation, apart from the very significant land border between the North and the Republic, the reality is that does present us with opportunities that we need to start to seize for how we tackle criminality, because a lot of what goes on involves crossing borders. Now, the reason why I mention those two capabilities, cyber and borders, is about a different way of thinking about how we pursue and how we tackle the threat, and to start to think genuinely about the problem, what it means for Helmand Province to every neighbourhood. Where are the opportunities? How do we understand the risks and the threats, and how do we intervene? And doing that in a contemporary way. That'll have big implications for our workforce. So we'll always need law enforcement officers that could go out, front up dangerous people, take their liberty away from them, prepare court files, give evidence to the court, all of that. Of course we will. But actually the sort of workforce we need in a data-rich investigative environment might be quite different. I think Martin Hewitt talked about some of this morning. So some very real opportunities to think differently, but it has to be a contemporary response. And that's exactly what we want from the NCA. We've got three ways of operating: lead, support, and coordinate. I'll just explain a little bit about that. So the responsibility that we've got to align the threat, which is align the response to the threat, which is enshrined in the Crime and Courts Act, gives Director General of NCA the duty to secure efficient and effective activities against serious and organised crime. And it's explicit in the notes, which is that's not just about the NCA's resources, it's about policing and the whole of law enforcement. And it's backed up where arrangements can't be made on a voluntary basis or can't be made quick enough. If actually we need a task, then we can give a direction that we need to undertake a particular activity. I think that's in extremis. I don't think people in policing and law enforcement are looking to avoid tackling difficult people. There are just sometimes choices that need to be made around balancing a local priority, a world that's seen by looking downwards and inwards, versus a world that actually is seen by looking upwards and outwards. And the interconnected nature of the threat means that the things that people see outside their front door might be best tackled outside their front door. It might be better tackled elsewhere, and we need to line up that response. So when we lead, our focus will be on priority and high priority serious and organised criminals and their groups, and we'll lead where we're the best agency to lead the response. And we'll look for support from across the whole of law enforcement. Where we'll support is where other agencies are in a better position to do that. And the support might look like using overseas reach or cyber or lawful intercept or our ability to board vessels and to do all of those things that actually policing and some parts of law enforcement can't do, and our relationship with the agencies, how we leverage the best intelligence coverage that we possibly can. And the final bit is about coordinating. Sometimes in a world where, and I've been there myself, I've done it, you can tend to see crime in bite-sized chunks depending on your locality, whether it's a local police, an area police force, or whatever it may be. Sometimes through sharing intelligence, you just need to bring law enforcement people together. There's been some very good examples in the media recently around a group of people who are offending all the way across the country, targeting museums and big houses for rhino horn and Chinese artifacts. What that needed was a level of coordination to bring all of it together, to give a clear focus and to deliver a set of outcomes that's involved locking up some very difficult people. So, lead, support, coordinate. The bit of leadership that we absolutely need to focus on, I'm sorry I'm going to keep on saying this, is pursuing the most dangerous that might be beyond the reach of an individual law enforcement agency. And doing that relentlessly, doing it creatively in the way that we do it, focus on bringing them to justice, but if we can't, we need to disrupt them and make it very, very difficult for them to do what it is that they might seek to do. Now, some challenges for all of us, I think, implicit in all of that. Some of it's about how you link up in a way where our objectives don't necessarily always align and overlap. One of the challenges that people told me I would face in this job was police and crime commissioners. Not in a bad way, but police and crime commissioners will have a manifesto about what they're going to deliver locally. How does that fit with something that's got to be delivered nationally? My experience so far has been that hasn't been a problem. Interestingly, what I wouldn't have predicted is most of the conversations with police and crime commissioners often are about action, fraud and cybercrime. They're not about the sort of well-hackneyed stuff that I was told those conversations are going to be about. People do get it, and I wonder to what extent PCCs are reflecting back to us, law enforcement professionals, what really bothers people when a crime recording system, if we're not careful, we can focus on traditional acquisitive crime rather than what happens online. We can focus on traditional forms of violence rather than children being bullied online and then self-harming. So there is something about really listening to the message that we're getting about what is the nature of criminality, and I haven't come across a PCC so far who hasn't recognised the importance of a national agency that brings particular capabilities and particular reach elsewhere than one would expect from a police force. But there is a challenge for how we line all of that up and we talk in a consistent way and we make consistent decisions. The National Intelligence Hub that we'll run is absolutely key to joining up what it is that people are operating nationally and internationally, then the effect they have locally. Very important we do it on an intelligence basis. Challenges for us, I think, around the digital environment, how we tackle some of that, and some very real challenges in mobilising an effort that goes well beyond the boundaries of law enforcement, because I do believe we need to think differently. For instance, for those people in the audience from local authorities, how we license some people that we know are involved in organised crime to carry on particular businesses, whether it's licensed premises, whether it's events. Surely that can't be right. But actually, to give local authorities, this is where we need to take responsibility, the opportunity to tackle that, we have to share information in a different way. You can't start to block what organised criminals are doing if you don't know who they are. So some interesting ethical, legal, frankly cultural issues for us about how we share information. And the final one I'd highlight is how we work with the private sector. If we accept that crossing borders, if we accept that cyber, if we accept that data sharing, all of those important aspects of what goes on are going to be key to pursuing serious and organised criminals, we need a different set of relationships with the private sector. And we in law enforcement are going to have to show some leadership on this, where we get over the idea that every time you share something with the private sector, it equals risk. I think the risk of not sharing is much greater than the risk of sharing in the first place. And that's partly about data, it's partly about capabilities, it's partly about knowledge and expertise. In the legislation, we've got the power to take on NCA specials. So we've deliberately borrowed specials from special constabulary volunteers. We could have hundreds by now, because I've been absolutely amazed, particularly from the private sector, with a number of people who are queuing up saying, I'd like to come and work with you on a voluntary basis and I can bring these skills. But we're doing it very thoughtfully and very carefully. We started with 10. The quality of these people is absolutely amazing. Whether it's their technical knowledge, whether they're researchers and academics, where they have particular knowledge of particular source countries or localities, language skills. There is a real energy out there where if we're not careful in public service, we almost position ourselves as the only ones that care about these things. And I don't think that's true. I think the vast majority of citizens care. If they understand what the problem is, they're trusted. Of course, we properly vet people, but they're trusted, they're bought in, and they're given a role and a responsibility. And our experience so far, only a few weeks in, is these people are really helping us do what we need to do. So, just a quick outline then of the parts of the agency, some of which is new, some of which builds on what's gone before. Organised Crime Command, you would expect us to have an Organised Crime Command, focused on trafficking, on organised crime groups, whether it's firearms, people, narcotics, fraudulent goods. Economic Crime Command, that's new. So a hugely complex environment around economic crime and law enforcement around economic crime. So I'd say that's fraud, bribery, corruption. Economic Crime Command's role is joining up the dots and making sure the right agency is in the right place to lead the response with support from the NCA and others. Border Policing Command, I've talked about that. Child exploitation. There's been a lot of debate about whether CEOP should have come in to the NCA. I think some of the results we're delivering straight away, where CEOP has access to 5,000 officers and an agency with the power and the legitimacy to ensure the proper response is in place. Some of the early results we're delivering in the east of England 2 weeks ago, several high-profile arrests of people who've been sharing, accessing, making child abuse images. I can't obviously say too much about that, but that's a different way of tackling the problem. We're absolutely clear about where the risk is, and we're going there with the right expertise, with the right skills, the right ability to forensically analyse what's gone on and bringing those people to justice. So child exploitation, and then finally the cybercrime unit, which isn't positioned as a command, it's cross-cutting, because the ministers were very keen and absolutely right to make the point this underpins so much of what we do, and it isn't just a threat of itself. So, you no doubt will want to ask me a few questions and perhaps give us some advice, and that'd be very helpful to me for how we're going to move the agency forward. The key thing that I wanted to leave you with is at the centre of our agency is pursuing and bringing to justice the most dangerous people, and we need to do that in a way which frankly has not been delivered so far. The key is that the interventions that we deliver, whether it's upstream, at the border, nationally, whether it's working alongside law enforcement or others across the UK, must deliver an effect. So some of what we've done through the launch of the NCA is we want to say to people, we're here. We want to be clear this is a law enforcement agency. So we'll show you the things that we're doing to the extent that we can, because we do a lot of covert work and we don't want to necessarily expose that. That's not in anyone's, I don't think it's going to help anyone at all. The breadth of the threats, so it's not just about narcotics, it's about people trafficking, it's about cyber, it's about fraudulent travel documents, focusing on all of that and doing it in a way which instills public confidence. And we need to be visible and have a different relationship with the public through the media. And we need our partners to be confident in what we do, because it's all about partnership working and joining up. And that's what we're trying to land. The mandate and the powers to lead a law enforcement agency that focuses on those serious and organised crime threats that require a national response. It's all about lining up what we do. Now, I think we've got off to a good start, 4 weeks in. Of course, I would say that. But I think we have got off to a good start. I think it's landed with people. I think the people that I speak to generally know what the NCA is and what we're about and what we're going to deliver. The key is now to build those key capabilities, front those challenges up that I've talked about, and make sure that with the police and law enforcement in particular, we have the tightest possible partnership and we're prioritising our effort day in, day out. Final point from me, the reason that all the way through the build of the agency we've involved chief police officers, border force, private sector officials, is because partnership and working together is at the very centre of what we do. And we've had fabulous support right the way across the policing and law enforcement community. And that's because there's a recognition that we've been on a journey of having no national agencies, a number of smaller agencies. SOCA delivered some really good things, and CEOP and Border Force and some of the other agencies or parts of that have come in to us. I think we've landed something now which gives us a really good platform to move on, but there's a lot more to do.